So today we're looking at women in Jesus' day. Now I'm going to give you so much information. It's like a fire hose of information that's coming at you today about women that lived in the time Jesus lived. So we're looking at about 30 AD. We're going to go all over the Mediterranean, and I'm going to tell you what life was like in the culture, what the laws were, what was expected in their homes, and all these details about them. So I've given you an outline. Don't feel compelled, you melancholy women out there, to try to write down everything, because there's just a lot that's going to come at you. But what I'd like for you to listen for are some nuances and some differences if you lived in this part of the world or at that part of the world, and some of the changes that may have taken place. So there's a lot that's going to be coming out at you, and I want you to think about which of these places might you have been able to survive, and where you could have thrived, or if no, there's just nothing that sounded appealing to you about any of those places. So the cultures in Jesus' day were very patriarchal. So women were subordinate, first of all, to their fathers, and then to their husbands. And if they had neither, there was somebody that they were accountable to, a male. And so that already is different. Here are some things, the quotes from the day. Plato suggested that a bad man's fate was reincarnation as a woman. Here's what Aristotle said. Females are imperfect males, accidentally produced by their father's inadequacy, or, get this, by the malign influence of a moist south wind. Josephus was of the opinion that the woman is inferior to man in every way. And a first century prayer for a man sounded like this: I thank you, God, that you did not make me a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. That's pretty tough, isn't it? Well, we're going to look at the role of women all around the Mediterranean. Think about the contrast to our culture. Think about the challenges the women faced. And then think about the opportunity Jesus saw in the challenges. Well, let's begin by looking first at Greece. Well, women in ancient Greece during Jesus' time faced legal and societal restrictions because it was a patriarchal culture. So the legal status: women were minors. They were minors under the law, living under the authority of the male. They could not own property, conduct legal or economic transactions independently. Inheritance was very limited. They could only inherit land if there were no male heirs, and even then, they had to marry within the clan in order to keep the family property. Marriages, they were arranged by the male relatives, and it was like a transfer from daddy's house to the husband's house, and a dowry went with them. Men could easily divorce the wives and send them packing back to the family, but women had no reciprocal rights. Their daily life, domestic roles, they were confined to that, weaving and managing all the household chores and duties. Wealthy women, listen to this, were often secluded as a status symbol. So they rarely went in public beyond religious festivals. They were excluded from voting, holding offices, and attending assemblies. Socially, women were expected to maintain the family honor, and that partly was through fidelity. Adultery by women was a punishable crime, but men did not face those same restrictions. Education for women was very rare. They learned only the basic things that could have been taught in the home. Male heirs were preferred, and unwanted daughters could be left on the hillside to die. So this restrictive environment in Greece underscored this inequality between men and women. in Jesus' time. Well, let's pick up and go to Rome. In 30 AD, they also lived under a patriarchal system. That's what influenced the legal rights. Their roles were shaped by the social norms. They had the legal constraints, and their expectations were tied mainly to two areas, family and morality. So legally, let's look at this. Women were under the guardianship of a male, a father, a husband, or a male relative. But this was so interesting. Some women, those who bore 3 or more children, gained limited independence. Isn't that interesting? Property rights, this is a little different from Greece. Women could own property and could manage finances, but they had to get the approval of a male guardian. In marriage, adultery was harshly punished for women, again reflecting the double standards. Men could divorce adulterous wives, but it didn't work in the other way. So there was that double standard also. In public roles, women could not vote, hold public office. They couldn't represent others in court. Legal proceedings were all, again, about gender inequality. In the cultural life, socially, they were, again, expected to embody chastity, moral virtue, loyalty to the family. And so the women wore specific clothes to indicate their status. It was called the stola. And so that indicated they were married, they were a part of a home, a family. But prostitutes wore togas that were more in line with what the men wore, and that was their mark of shame. So you could tell by looking at what a woman was wearing whether they were chaste or not. Education, upper class women were educated. Now that's different from Greece. They were educated in literature, philosophy, basic math, but most of that was to help them fulfill the domestic roles. But lower class women worked very hard. They were midwives, they were seamstresses, and they were shopkeepers. So what we're seeing here now is that the roles were in the class structure more in Rome. In religious roles, women participated. They were able to go to religious festivals and rituals. Now, you may have heard the term Vestal Virgins. Those were the virgin goddesses of Rome. They held this unique religious authority. And so they were set apart, but they were bound by very strict vows of chastity. But there was also entertainment in Rome, and women could go to the public games. They could go to the gladiator events and banquets. They could go with the men alongside of them. So there was some sort of social integration that we're seeing in Rome. The Roman society had a clear divide among the respectable women and those who were called immoral. So the laws and the customs were reflected in both their public and their private lives. But here was an interesting side note here. When Jesus came, Christianity spread because of wealthy Roman women. All right, now we're going to pick up and move again. We're going to Egypt now. Egypt in 30 AD was ruled by Rome. So we're going to see a reflection of Roman rule with the Egyptians. And so the status and the cultural life of women is going to reflect a little bit of ancient Egypt and Rome and their legal practices. So legally, the ancient Egyptian women had a lot of significant rights. They could own property, they could initiate a divorce, and they could conduct business. Now that was in ancient Egypt. And then Rome came to rule, And this is what happened. They had to live under the restrictions of the Roman rule. So imagine having these legal options and these wonderful advantages, and then Roman rule changed it all. They were then required to have a male guardian that would allow their transactions. And that's kind of like the Greek practices also. Roman law granted some autonomy to women with, guess what, 3 children. And they could act without male representation. Or in your mind trying to process, okay, why have more children? Well, they needed help around the home. They wanted to ensure they had a male heir, and so they got more rights for having more children. And also, the oldest daughter at this time could be an heir. So that's a little unusual too. In the cultural life, they participated in various professions. So they could be in weaving, they could do food producing, they could be in agriculture, they could do trading in the marketplace. And then elite women had even more privileges. They could have religious roles. They could be a priestess. They could also be a temple singer. So they got some perks there. Women could also be dancers and musicians and professional mourners at funerals. Anybody want that one? Those roles were considered respectable across all social classes. Fertility rituals and medical practices surrounding pregnancy were very significant at this time. This is going to shock you. Women used contraceptives. We're in 30 AD. I know your mouths are dropping. And you know what else they did? They engaged in sexual practices that determined their baby's sex. How about that? 30 AD. There is nothing new under the sun, is there? There really isn't. So despite Roman influence, Egyptian women retained some legal independence and some cultural contributions that went back to their ancient traditions. All right, so that's Egypt. Now let's look at Macedonia. That's considered what we would call today northern Greece. That would be Thessaloniki. The book of Thessalonians was written to this group, so that's the part of the world we're talking about. Women in Macedonia in 30 AD enjoyed relatively more freedoms, and they had more influence compared to people in other parts of the Greco-Roman world. So let's look at that. There's social and legal status. Macedonian women could own property. That's different from the others, isn't it? They could participate in business. They could act independently, especially if they became widowed or divorced. Unlike other regions, they were less constrained with a male guardian, so they could engage in public affairs. They were known for their competence and influence. They could be regents. They could command armies. They could be a part of building cities. They could negotiate political matters. See how very different it is there? So they're in religious roles. They played significant roles. That included temple building. They could go to public worship. And the royal Macedonian women, like the Greek princess Olympias, held prominent positions in the religious practices of the day. So we could say that Macedonia had a progressive stand on women's rights that enabled them to play really vital roles in society. And do you see that might have helped set them up for the growth of Christianity? Think about that, because they were already engaged in culture. They already were women of influence. Think of the other places and how hard it's going to be for them to come out of the guardianship roles, out of the restrictions, the fear that they must have experienced. So women fared better here in Macedonia. Now let's go to Palestine. Now in 30 AD, we're talking about what is modern day Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. Now some of us have been to all three. Who's been to all of those places? So all of those are, when you go on a Holy Land trip, these are your options. So this is what we consider in the modern era of the Israeli cities. Think about Jerusalem, Caesarea, Gaza, Jericho, Philadelphia. I'm trying to give you some biblical context. You've heard of these places. So in Palestine, Hebrew women were among the poorest in the world in Jesus' day. So we're hearing about the other locations where they had women of wealth and some of the privileges they got. In one place, they had stuck at home. In others, they had great influence in the culture. The culture and legal life of women in Palestine was shaped mostly by these three things: religious traditions, societal norms, and Roman rule. Now remember, Roman rule in Israel, in Jerusalem, when Jesus was in ministry. Who killed Jesus? The Romans. Okay, so this is the rule. Let's look at their legal status. Religious law. Women's legal rights were governed by Jewish religious law. So that's what defined their role in family and society. So these laws often placed women in subordinate positions to men, particularly when it came to marriage and divorce and inheritance. And inheritance always favored the men in Palestine. As far as witness testimony, women were not considered full full persons. Let that soak in a minute. You're not a full person if you're a woman. So they wouldn't have any standing in court if you're not a full person. So their word was not given weight. Marriage. They married at a very young age here. And most often it was arranged by their fathers or their guardians. And in Jewish tradition, it was always both a religious and a contractual agreement for marriage. You could easily be divorced. And it could be, I read this, something as simple as burning dinner. And something as egregious as adultery. So how many today would have been sent back home to daddy? Well, you're not adulterers if you raise your hand, necessarily. But there were only 6 of us who ever burned dinner in the room, it seems. So women also could not initiate the divorce. Economic dependence. Well, some women managed the household resources. But their economic autonomy was very limited. They could own property, but they had to go to the male oversight to get oversight for it. Now, cultural life. Let's look at their domestic roles. Their place was in the home, yes. They were responsible for household duties, the food prep, all the weaving of the clothes, and for child care. Just this one thing they did, grinding grain to make flour, would take hours every day. Just that one responsibility. They did labor-intensive work in the household. Religious participation. They could engage in religious practices, but were generally excluded from any kind of leadership roles. They were not able to take on any kind of major responsibilities in the synagogues or in any other religious institution. I have several. Any kind of responsibilities whatsoever. And so their participation was really limited to rituals, and they could go to festivals. But they were also limited in where they could go into the temple to worship. They had to always stay 5 steps below the court for men. So they could never get close to the rabbi. Rabbis did not speak to women in public. Think about that. Could not even speak to them. But the women could lead table prayers at home. Hip, hip, hooray for that. Artistic expression, I found this interesting. These women practiced embroidery as a significant cultural tradition. Now, they put embroidery in their clothing to tell stories. They reflected their social status. Their clothing then was embroidery to reflect what tribe they were a part of. What village did they live in? And so this was a beautiful craft for them to do. And it was a visual identity for them. It's a way to preserve their history. And I thought that was interesting too. Now, when they had time to do that, I don't know. That's why they needed so many children, isn't it? To get all this done. Medical expertise. Women often served as midwives here also. And again, that was a dangerous responsibility. It took much training, and but that was a job that women would like to participate in. Women here, though, in Palestine were typically invisible and powerless. Now, that is where the women lived. Those were the customs of the time. And I want to show you some pictures of how they lived in a home. So I'm going to show you a first century house that I was able to visit in 2020. This is called the Parables House. And it was recreated and designed on the inside now. It was all set up, and all the belongings, the furniture and everything that was in there was designed to remind everybody who toured it of certain parables of Jesus. So you're going to see some things on the walls and in the rooms that were significant of a parable that Jesus taught. This is in a little Christian village called Taiba. And so you'll see the house, it has 3 different levels. And so it had this space for the family. It had a space for the large animals and smaller animals, and so they could roam about. There's a little divot in that door, do you see? And so you could close the gate, and that was small enough for a little animal to go through. And so nothing's new. You know, all of that, you have doggy doors? Who has a doggy door? That is nothing new. That back to 30 AD. And so the house and its domestic and agriculture furnishings now. So those things all symbolize some particular story that Jesus talked about. Also, this house is a reminder of perhaps how the Nativity Cave may have looked in Bethlehem and how it may have been configured. So we'll just go through and look at the pictures. You look at the walls, and see, that's the door. See, that's like a little cave that's in the middle of the house. See the pottery at the top. Those are like women's clothing, tunics that were hanging. That's a grain silo in that picture. And so that's like a typical house from the first century. Well, there you have it. Women living in the times of Jesus. It's really a far cry from how we live, isn't it? Well, we're going to pause now